Is my mic working?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay.
It is. Is mine working?
Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Katherine Bennett.
I'm Gavin Ashenden. Actually, Dr. Gavin Ashenden, for the sake of this particular broadcast. You'll see why in a minute.
Well, Dr. Gavin Ashenden, I have asked you to talk with me today about Dr. Jordan Peterson and Dr. Richard Dawkins.
Professor.
Professor, oh, I knew I'd get that wrong. Because I haven't yet had a chance to see the conversation between them, moderated, I think it was, by Alex, what's his name? Cosmic Skeptic, moderated by Alex O'Connor. But you have seen it, and is it well worth watching, Gavin?
Well, Katherine, it's a car crash. It's a very, very exciting car crash. There are so many ways of looking at this. You could see it as a very bad psychotherapy session with Dawkins, the reluctant client, and Jordan Peterson, the very frustrated therapist who starts to shout, just like an Englishman talking English abroad to the French. You know, if I shout, he may get it. It was awful. It was absolutely wonderful and awful at the same time. Wonderful because here were these two giants having a conversation they needed to have on behalf of our whole civilization because they represent antithetic positions. It was awful because Dawkins wouldn't play and Peterson didn't know how to make him play, however clever and sensitive he was. And they both really, Dawkins got more petulant and more triumphalistic and more na-na-na-na-na, and Peterson got more frustrated and began to raise his voice and some wonderful touches. So Dawkins tried to seduce Peterson by calling him Jordan, but surely Jordan. And Peterson absolutely refused, saying, Dr. Dawkins, keeping the boundaries of the therapy session in place. If it wasn't therapy, it might have been a symposium. There are all kinds of models you could use. And Alex, somebody O'Connor in the middle, who seemed to be only about 12 and a half, I thought, having the impossible job of moderating it and ever so often ruining the conversation completely because he decided too long a time had gone by without him making an intelligent comment. So you can see him thinking of an intelligent comment, with which he then slips in at entirely the wrong moment and breaks up the one softening moment that appeared to be between them, which he then ruined and turned into a non sequitur. So, but the arguments and the process of the whole debate were utterly fascinating.
Well, Alex O'Connor can't be much more than 12. He's been recording out of his bedroom since he was in sixth form, I think, and he's got a huge audience, very, very popular, and really does his research well. So I suppose he was as good a person to moderate as any, although I'm sorry if his intervention stopped a softening between Peterson and Dawkins. But what were the issues under discussion, and how far did they get?
I'm probably a bit jealous, and I just thought that his moustache was just too bushy for a man his age. But be that as it may, I mean, of course, he did as good a job as he could do. It was an impossible job, in fact. So the issues were really extremely interesting. The project, which quite clearly had begun with Jordan, was to try and overcome the bifurcation between the two cultures that we have. So we have an empirical culture, an Enlightenment culture, a scientific revolution culture. I'm going to work out how important things are by how I measure them culture, of which biologists are probably the primary exponents, really, of the empirical way of looking at reality. So reality for many biologists involves almost no philosophy, no theology, no mystery, no spirituality. It's just the nothing which creates something which expresses itself through evolution. That's their world, and they measure it. On the other hand, you have Jordan Peterson, who's become, as a psychologist, an exponent for the symbolic, for the philosophical, for the theological, almost a Christian but not quite, but an extraordinary exponent of meaning, as meaning appears to make itself accessible through the arts, through literature, through religious experience, through the subconscious, through almost every human pore. And what Jordan started off with this idea that truth must be unifying. If truth is not unifying, then the implications of that are awful. And he presumed that Dawkins would accept that as a presupposition and then cooperate with him to see if they could unify the two different worlds of reality they lived in, the literary world and the allegorical world, the practical world and the metaphysical world. And Dawkins just wasn't playing. He just refused. There were a few wonderful telltale moments when Peterson talked about the world of morality and Dawkins sneered and said, "Morals leave me totally cold." And I thought, absolutely, that's right. There is an atheist position which is amoral in the sense it doesn't, well, actually immoral. It doesn't like morality. The intellectual people who hold it don't want to be held accountable. But you could see Dawkins had no interest in morality or in value. He had the slightly pompous, over clever person's delight in the grasp of empirical measurement and theory. But the reason Jordan thought this was worth doing was because Dawkins is credited with inventing the meme. And the meme is a kind of self-replicating idea that passes from one brain to another. And for a Jungian, this is very exciting because it's really like an archetype. So the Jungian thinks that all human beings have, if you like, built-in memes of certain shapes, which experience, if you like, falls into and gets molded by. So these are so similar that he really hoped he could get Dawkins to accept that they had a common language in either the meme or the archetype. But Dawkins just wasn't playing. And it became clear that he had no imagination, didn't want to have an imagination. He was a literalist of the worst kind. He kept on saying to Jordan, but is it true? But true in a very limited sense. What was true for Jordan meant full of value, full of meaning, full of, pregnant with possibility, inspirationally fecund. What was true for Dawkins was, can I measure it? And every so often, so for example, and Dawkins wrecked it by trying to trip Jordan Peterson up by saying, well, say you're big on Cain and Abel. Are you going to tell me that Cain actually existed? And Peterson says, it's a stupid question. It doesn't matter whether Cain exists dead because he exists now. It's the continued, the perpetual, and then Dawkins says, well, is Genesis divinely inspired? And Peterson says, well, it's about the most profound piece of literature that I've ever come across. So if anything's going to qualify for it, it would. No, that's not enough, said Dawkins. Prove it. Assert it. I want to knock you down. Anyway, do you believe in the virgin birth? And then, Peterson sidesteps annoying Christians, but also annoying Dawkins, saying any culture that doesn't understand the iconography of the mother and the child and the sacredness of them is going to die. So, I absolutely believe in that sense. But do you believe in it literally? Came back Dawkins. So halfway through, Dawkins began to say, you've got a different mind from mine. You're drunk on metaphor. He was very rude, actually, having tried to seduce Peterson into a sort of, Jordan and Richard thing. He was absolutely prepared to be as rude as anything in order to win the argument. And Peterson kept on begging him to play, to try. He said there came a moment when they were talking about Dostoevsky and was Dostoevsky true? Did Alyosha really exist? No, he's in a novel. No, but he exists. He's real. He's everywhere. Alyosha is in all of us. And Dawkins just couldn't get that at all. This was prefigured by C.P. Snow in 1959 when he gave a very important lecture at Cambridge saying there are two cultures have grown up. One is literary, full of people who read Shakespeare, and one is scientific, full of people who understand the second law of thermodynamics, and they don't talk to each other. And Peterson begged Dawkins and said, look, I've read the literature on both sides. And I'm looking for somebody who might be willing to do something similar from his side. Have you read Eliade or Neumann? And this is why you should. And Dawkins was contemptuous of the project. That was what was so sad. So, Peterson tried everything. He tried the notion. They got bogged down with the existence of dragons at one point. And Peterson tried to talk to him about sacrifice. So Dawkins is furious about sacrifice in the Old Testament, and Peterson says, but sacrifice is the heart of everything. Have you not sacrificed in order to gain certain things? I mean, I wanted him to say, I remember the sacrifice for my PhD. I sacrificed 7 summers in order to write up my PhD part-time. I remember the sacrifice, thinking, well, this is going to be worth it. And but at no point did Dawkins ever take on board the importance of the notion of sacrifice, which of course starts with the sacrifice of animals and becomes the sacrifice of Jesus. And Peterson just tried everything and failed and began to shout. And his annoying voice got more annoying, and Connor kept on trying to come in and build a bridge between them. It was an impossible job. But the reason why it was so wonderful now was because it as Peterson said, if the world is going to be saved, we have to build a bridge between fact and value. We have to be able to allow literalists and allegoricists to talk to each other and understand each other. The closest he got was when he said to Dawkins, "You called yourself a cultural Christian." Then Dawkins said, "Yeah, but I didn't mean it. Yeah, I mean nothing by it at all." And then Jordan said, "Well, you do realize that if your university peers had read Eliade instead of Marx, then they wouldn't be in the postmodern mess they're in now. And what's going to happen, Dawkins and Professor Dawkins, when the culture wars overtake your university and biology is no longer biology?" Because that's, of course, is what's happened with the whole trans debate. And Dawkins doesn't seem to realize or care that his whole discipline is being undermined by postmodernity. And Peterson was saying, you've got to join me in the value amphitheater if you're going to save your facts. And Dawkins just didn't get it. And it's such a tragedy, because if Dawkins and Peterson had managed to make this venture a common one, well, they could indeed save our culture. I mean, apart from anything else, it would allow us to talk about the values of Christianity to empirical scientists who might or might not believe in the resurrection in a way that allowed them to meet us halfway, because the values work. And one of the reasons that we're Christians is not just because we believe in the incarnation or the virgin birth. Whether Peterson does or doesn't, we don't know, but he knows the values work. And one of the things he's been doing so well, much better than me, better than Bishop Barron, better than anybody, he's been able to sell the values to a very hungry, empirically nurtured society, because our society is basically made in the image of Dawkins. And he was looking for allies, but failed to find them.
Well, I think that certainly sounds like a really fruitful way to go when Peterson's asking him about values, and actually if he doesn't have underlying values, then his own scientific branch will be in jeopardy. And I think there's something disingenuous. I've always thought this about Dawkins and the like. My brother is like Dawkins on heat. So I'm well used to
the thought of Dawkins on heat is really quite unpleasant. Sorry, dear God, I've interrupted you. Go on.
And I know the frustration. It really is like you're talking different languages, and I think even from what you've described there, it sounds like it would be a frustrating watch. I think it does expose the problems. You talked about going to university and focusing either on science or literature, and I think time was when you would have done both. I think we've narrowed now, both in schools and in higher education, the curriculum so much. It's not as broad as it once was. And so education has changed, and we're seeing the fruits of that education having narrowed to the point where you are lumped here or there. But actually, you'll know as well, there was a time that theology was the queen of the sciences. The queen of the sciences. So Dawkins is a victim, really, and is typical of the times in which we live.
There's a very nice man called Tim Metham, who was husband of one of the headmistresses of Rodin when I also taught at Rodin sometimes. And Tim was responsible for the art science module at Sussex. Sussex had this compulsory art science module where originally it forced artists to learn science, which was brilliant. And then it dropped that, it's been too difficult. But it forced scientists to learn arts. And so I lectured scientists in the psychology of religion. But it was absolutely brilliant and really essential, because it was trying to do what was trendy in those days, but now is absolutely essential. And the reason it's essential is because the cultural crisis that we're in is born of pragmatists and empiricists who don't understand the importance of philosophy, of value, and of faith, and think it comes out of some form of obscurantism. And so the problem is we live in a technological society which essentially is built in the image of Dawkins and the science movement and culture. So I wasn't saying that to try and be posh. I don't think teaching, I mean, I'm not sure where Sussex is ranked nowadays, but I'm afraid it's not ranked very high. So, but I did want to say that it has been tried, but it didn't succeed very well. But the reason this is worth watching is because it shows both how important the conversation is and how necessary it is to try and solve it. So Dawkins would have been a very, very good feather in the cap for Peterson to get. But there will be other scientists who will be less obdurate. I mean, there already are other scientists, of course. I mean, that wonderful mathematician John Lennox, who absolutely gets it. And if Lennox and Peterson were...
Yeah, you see, I feel like they're digging Dawkins up from the grave. He seems to have a renewal, but a forced renewal from Alex O'Connor. But I'm not sure he really is the speaking for that view anymore. I don't think he's as popular. I think his star has fallen, and I can see why. I know Jordan and him have been liaising back and forth about whether they should speak. But I feel like the times have changed even since Dawkins was really at his prime, such that people can see through some of what he said. Obviously, his disciples will always be rigidly, like I said about my brother, rigidly attached to that empirical worldview. But I do think he's now had that conversation with Jordan Peterson in a time which is where we are grappling with this meaning crisis, and there is a sense of re-enchantment. Someone like Jonathan Pajot has huge audiences, and he talks about symbolism and patterns, and I think people can see it. And when Dawkins says something like, I don't have any interest in morality, it's patently disingenuous.
He lives a morality that suits him, and whatever suits him is what he lives. And I mean, it's not Muslim, but it's certainly not Christian. I think one of the things we see is that the four horsemen of the apocalypse were a fruitless way of managing worldviews, because all they could agree on is how much they disliked God. So there are scientists, like John Lennox, who are much better at being bilingual in the way that Jordan wanted. But I think probably because Dawkins is so famous, Jordan wanted to get his scalp, really. And if he could build a bridge with Richard Dawkins, that would be symbolically really quite a clever thing to do. But I think strange for psychologists, I think he completely misunderstood Dawkins's lack of imagination and his desire, in a rather petty and immoral way, to win battles rather than contribute to a profound conversation.
Interestingly, I was at a talk with Lord Alton this week in the House of Lords. He'd invited Professor Marcus Cole, who is Dean of the Law School at Notre Dame University. And he was saying how they're one of the only universities that doesn't suffer with the chaos that goes on at the elite universities in the US now, the encampments, the stand-ins, the Palestinian flag waving, the cancellation, the abuse, shouting and throwing things, telling speakers that they're not welcome. And he said, even though they have a diverse student population, they don't suffer those same problems at Notre Dame Law School. And he talked about why that was. And he said, we have a unifying set of values, and it's a Catholic university. And he says, we have Muslim students, we have Catholic students, we have atheist students, but we have a unifying set of values that we make very clear. And he spoke about the dignity of the human person. He spoke about sanctity. He spoke about freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. And it was all very interesting. And he's absolutely right that you need to have that. You need to have that ground of values before you can build anything else. But in the question session, people were drawing attention to the fact that the problem nowadays is that we've lost that. So even if you were to say you can come to this university as long as you accept the foundational idea that we are all created in the image of God and must treat one another with respect, and that we are all sacred from creation, you wouldn't. How do you have that conversation? How do you get people to agree to that when they don't really understand sanctity? They don't really understand dignity, or the idea that we've been created at all, that there's any givenness. Why should anyone respect a being because they've been made in the image and likeness of God if they reject God entirely? No wonder it's so difficult to have that unifying ground of value, which goes back to what you were saying of Peterson making that very point to Dawkins. Look, the faculty you have, the scientific exploration you seek to do, will no longer be able to be done if you don't accept that there needs to be a ground of value on which you base all of those assumptions that what you're doing is important. It was Hume, wasn't it, who spoke about that is-ought fallacy, the idea that you cannot go from an is to an ought. You cannot go from a set of facts to what ought to be. And so this is Dawkins' position. So you just have to insert naturalism or some other thing, and there's no obvious reason why you need to do that. But the thing is, it just is. It's not a case of you have to do that and Dawkins rejects the idea. That is just how things are. The frustrating thing for Peterson, I would imagine, and I'm going to look back at what he said, is getting Dawkins to accept those presuppositions, which he simply can't do. And if somebody doesn't do that and they can't accept that, even though they live, there's an incoherence between how they live and what they profess to believe, then I think that the conversation is inevitably going to be fruitless.
Part of the problem is, as Peterson established, that when they looked at why they might have two entirely different mindsets, Peterson said, well, are you interested more in things than people? And although Dawkins prevaricated, it was perfectly clear he was more interested in things. But so the difficulty is that those people who are interested in things and have that mindset, if they fail to exercise their imagination, live in either value-free or value-challenged worlds, and contribute to this awful bifurcation of fact and value, which is essentially leads us to be schizophrenic. And I think one of the things that we have to do as Christians is to say it's not just a matter of having faith. One of the things I always try and suggest to people is that it's not faith versus unbelief. It's different worldviews. And the Christian worldview works extremely well. It's good for people. William James, who was an agnostic, said that what matters, you test something by the effect that it has, which was why he was so profoundly sympathetic to Christianity.
Yes, but of course Dawkins doesn't live in a value-free world. He himself holds certain things as more valuable than others. For example, the pursuit of science, the emphasis on facts, the relativity of morality. So these are things that he values. So he doesn't live in a value-free world at all. And I don't know that I would want to go down the consequentialist route as a Catholic and say, but look how your life is more ordered if you are a Christian, and look at the effects of being a Christian, because then you might as well substitute Christianity with utilitarianism. Look, if you do this and you live like this, then your life will be more comfortable. Your life may not be more comfortable as a Christian. Your life will often involve a lot of suffering, but it will certainly be more, it will have ultimate meaning, like it will have eternal meaning. And you understand yourself in a church that is hierarchical, that is made up of the saints in heaven, the suffering souls in purgatory, and the militant church on earth. You are part of an eternal vision.
What I was suggesting was that at the very most simplistic level, when you're dealing with someone with no imagination, who can't make the leap that Peterson was asking Dawkins to make, that given that as you quite rightly say, they're going to have values, you're entitled to say, I think, whether it's consequentialism or not, but our values have better outcomes than yours do, and therefore the things that you treasure best will be available if you support a Christian society. But as you quite rightly said, then that can't possibly be the beginning, the end of the conversation. It's only one possible beginning of one possible conversation. So you're right. It's very limited in its scope. One has to say, but actually, if you want to go to heaven and be free of judgment, if you want to know salvation, if you want to immerse yourself with truth, in the truth, then of course you have to believe and sacrifice yourself and live the life of a believer, experience rebirth into the new paradigm. But sometimes one needs to try and find a more simpler, pragmatic bridge to throw across the chasm, just to see whether or not people can crawl a little bit closer to the light before they make the leap of faith.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. It's not even if you want to get to heaven, it's what you've been created for. It's that idea of purpose. And of course, for Dawkins and others like him, your purpose is to procreate, propagate your species and then die, and then the whole of the earth disappears and everything's blown up, and that's the end of it, and nothing has any meaning. So what is the purpose? Christians have a different understanding. They see value in all things. They see purpose in all things. And actually, I would say not just Christians see it, but there's no escaping that. There is no escaping the fact that there is a purpose to all things, to all man-made created things. There is a purpose. From my pen to my calculator to this microphone, it tends towards an end. And that is true of the natural world as well. Everything in the natural world tends towards an end. And so what's missing is this sense of purpose, which is just completely eradicated by Dawkins' worldview. And I do think it's disingenuous, because I think he lives in a world of meaning and a world of purpose and a world where every single thing points towards a telos. And he simply says, well, I'm going to ignore it. Well, he can ignore it all he wants, but it doesn't stop it being true, is the point. So who do you think won?
Teleology rules. Teleology rules. Entropy fails. Everybody lost. Nobody won and everybody lost. We lost because Jordan didn't succeed. Jordan lost because he couldn't rouse Dawkins' imagination. Dawkins lost because he got stuck in his dugout. Alex O'Connor lost because he couldn't build the bridges between them. The whole thing was a complete failure in one sense, but having shown us how serious the failure is, maybe out of that failure, God can bring some renewed venture on a different platform. Who knows? That's the challenge, I think.
I hope so. Of course, I'll finish with a tweet from Jonathan Pajot, who is somebody I would love to see Dawkins engage with. I know Dawkins has avoided engaging with certain people for the last number of years. He did used to have conversations with people in the public sphere, in fact, more often with Christians, and he's since argued that there's no point in having conversations with Christians, which is convenient, of course. But I don't know if he's yet spoken to Jonathan Pajot. I don't think he has. Pajot says, if only Dawkins would take a few more sips of his own memes theory. Well, of course, the mimetic theory is René Girard, isn't it? Who came up with this idea of we're all predestined to imitate the desires of others. He said, then we could have a conversation, but until then, I'll let Jordan Peterson continue to hack away at that iron statue with feet of clay. From the book of Daniel. Yes, the iron statue with the feet of clay. Well, I'll go and watch Jordan Peterson in conversation with Richard Dawkins, with Alex O'Connor moderating, and see what I make of it. And who knows, we might do a part 2 with Mark included sometime soon and look at it again with fresh eyes. I'm Katherine Bennett.
I'm Gavin Ashenden.